Hi, I'm Nick Vitzi with Bradley Technical Services. We're going to walk through the process to change out a sensor in the Verge soap system. Our demo unit today is from the Zen Series 6-3700, but the following information applies to all 4 products in the product line. Changing the sensor on the Verge soap system does require removing the spout completely from the fixture. To do that, we'll begin by disconnecting the spout from the pump assembly. Disconnect power, the LED cable, the vent tube, and the soap pump tube. When disconnecting the sensor cable, grip closely to the breakpoint in the cable. With all the cables disconnected, we can separate the fill tube. Note that the pump assembly and tank is going to remain in place, so we do not need to disconnect the level sensors. Once everything is disconnected, unscrew the wing nut to release the spout. Once the wing nut is removed, pull the basket spacer down and separate the cables. At this point, you can lift the dispenser off of your countertop. With the spout removed, we'll need the following tools to change the sensor. The soap fill key, or if that's not available, a 3mm Allen wrench, a Phillips screwdriver, preferably number 1 size, a needle nose pliers, and if possible, a long reach needle nose pliers may be very helpful. And of course, have a replacement sensor ready to go. To begin, we need to remove the shank from the spout. Do this using the soap fill key or the 3mm Allen wrench. With the shank lifted up, we need to remove the 2 screws that are holding the sensor cable to the shank. Once the screws are out, slide the sensor cable through the shank. You may need to push the sensor cable end to get it through the shank body. Set the shank aside for later. With the shank removed, we need to disconnect and remove the spout position sensor. Remove this Phillips screw. Then lift the entire sensor. There are 2 wires on the back side, which will need to slide through this slot in the casting. With the cables disconnected, we can now begin disassembling the sensor housing. Begin by removing the 4 screws around the sensor pod. Note that some models only have 2 screws in these positions. Finally, remove the 2 screws that are actually holding the sensor to the pod. Note that unlike the rest of the screws we have taken out of the spout, these screws will be disposed of and not reused. Once everything is free, you can lift the entire body up and separate the pod from the sensor housing. And at this point, the sensor can be slid out of the soap body. Make sure to move the cable connections at the end so that they do not get stuck on anything. With everything disconnected, we're ready to begin reinstalling our new sensor. Note that your new sensor kit will come with 2 replacement screws for that housing position where we discarded the screws earlier. I'll go through a few different ways of feeding this through the spout because there is some complication with the 2 different cables on this sensor. You can directly feed the cables through, and this is where having a needle nose pliers is very useful. Both the main sensor cable and the spout position sensor cable need to be brought up and through the system. On some models, you may find it easier to wrap the cables together hooking the position sensor into the last loop or two of the cable on the main sensor. This can help guide the second half of that sensor cable right through along with the main cable. In this case, however, it fell off and I'm really no better off than I was to begin with. This is a technique that I find helpful on the Metro series faucets. If you do use this technique, as soon as you get both halves of the sensor cable through the spout, it's important to untangle the cable that you previously wrapped together. This will allow the spout to freely extend when it is later being removed for refilling. After using either method to get the sensor cables through the spout shank, I like to reconnect the position sensor first, just so that I do not accidentally drop it back into the spout. To do this, we're going back to the screws we originally removed from taking the shank off. Note that one of these screws has a shoulder on it. This is the one we will be using to connect the position sensor. Begin by feeding the wires back through the slot in the casting and dropping the position sensor back into the hole. With the spout position sensor installed, we can go back to the sensor itself and reconnect it to the pod. Use only the new screws that were provided with the sensor. I like to connect these two first while I can put some pressure on the back side of the sensor lens. And once they're installed, we'll reconnect the other four around the pod body. At this point, the sensor is fully reinstalled, and the last thing to reconnect is the shank itself. Pass the sensor cable back through the shank body. In order to find the alignment of the sensor cable to the shank, I like to align the screw where it will match up with the spout casting, and find the most neutral position for this cable to connect to the shank. This will keep it from twisting excessively inside the spout. Finally, reseat the shank onto the spout and tighten with the fill key or the 3mm Allen wrench. We're now ready to reinstall this onto our countertop. Begin by feeding these cables back through our countertop. It helps to make sure everything is straight and not crossed over each other. In narrower holes, these may become tangled and prevent you from installing the fixture. Once the spout is back onto the countertop, we need to reinstall the spacer basket. Note that there is a keyway on the shank that matches this divot on the basket. There's also a smaller hole and a larger hole. The smaller hole is for the main soap tube only. The larger hole takes the sensor cable, the vent line, and the LED cable. Once all of these are together, again, make sure the lines are not wrapped and crossed over each other. This is easier to adjust now before you push it up onto the shank. Once everything is aligned, slide the basket up into place and reconnect the wing nut. At this point, we can reconnect our soap fill tube. And reconnect all the sensor lines and cables. Finally, reconnect power and test your system. Note that our display unit is blinking red because a red flash is the low soap indicator and we don't have any soap in our tank. Our demonstration example for the sensor change was done on a top fill individual system. There is a small difference in the multi-feed version of the Verge soap system. I have a multi-feed spout here. Most of the process is done exactly the same. Note that the soap tube does pass through the shank and would need to be removed, but this just slides out. The important difference is that the sensor cable is only one wire. There is no reed switch line from the sensor. The casting will have a slot and a hole for this portion of the sensor. The service item will have the reed switch, and this does need to be installed. You should go through the process as we described, fit it into the casting, and mount it with a screw. This will allow the system to work properly.